Yes, please.
All right, welcome everyone. So it's an honor to have Dr. Kiawe Kahalakula be a presenter for today's interprogrammatic seminar. Dr. Kahalakula does not really need an introduction. He's a professor at the Department of Native Hawaiian Health at the School of Medicine, and he also chairs the program. He's one of the national leaders in the area of indigenous health research. Dr. Kahalakula leads the Center for Pacific Innovations, Knowledge and Opportunities, among several other successful research and infrastructure grants. So without wasting too much time, I'd like to welcome him to present. Thank you.
My apologies. I thought I had my camera on. Sorry about that. Mahalo, Dr. Packrell, for that introduction, and mahalo for the invite to present today to all of you. And also, I apologize if you've maybe heard this talk in different ways or different settings, but hopefully some of this material today will be new for many of you. I'll be talking to historical, social, and cultural determinants of Native Hawaiian health. And sorry about that. I'm just having a little trouble with advancing my slides here. I wasn't sure if I needed the disclosure for this particular presentation, but just in case, I have no relevant financial conflicts to disclose. As mentioned, I'm a full professor in Native Hawaiian Health here at JABSOM, currently funded by NIH for my research, some of which will be presented here. And of course, as a Native Hawaiian clinical psychologist and behavioral scientist, the topic reflects my clinical, scientific, and cultural perspectives, and sometimes they get a little jumbled up a bit. So a little disclosure there on my part. I always like to start my talks about Native Hawaiian health with good news. So I take us back to 1778 for a moment. And I start with good news because a lot of what we talk about is around health inequities, health disparities, social determinants of health that often don't work in favor of our communities. So I like to start off reminding us that Native Hawaiians, like other Pacific Islanders prior to Western intrusion, was very healthy, robust populations. In fact, these writings here that you see here, the quotes, are from the officers on board the Cook's expedition here to Hawaii in 1778. Captain James King here wrote about the physical well-being that he saw of Native Hawaiians. Natives of these islands are in general above middle size, capable of very graceful, run nimbly, and capable of great fatigue. Now, contrast that today to some of the highest rates of obesity in our communities. That's not what these Westerners first saw when they came to Hawaii in 1778. David Samuel, the surgeon on board, also noticed that Native Hawaiians on a social level were very, happy population. And that it wasn't until later that we learned from other the missionaries primarily that came in 1820 to Hawaii, who provided the world with a different narrative of Native Hawaiians suffering, in need of salvation, and in fear of their lives against the oppressive chiefs and kings of the time, which was not what Captain James Cook and his men first observed when they came in 1778 to these islands. Of course, others had a different agenda for why they were here on the islands, and a narrative needed to fit their agenda. But that's a different presentation. I want to first provide a context to my talk today, because I think it's important to understand the situation of Native Hawaiians here in their own homelands in Hawaii, which is similar to many other indigenous populations across the world. So in the 1800s, we saw the Native population decimated by infectious diseases for which they had no natural immunity to ward off at the time. I list some of them here on the screen for you. What I do want to note is that the Native Hawaiian population was estimated to be around 800,000 in 1778. And it dwindled down to barely 30,000 by by the time we approached or came into the 1900s. And that's a significant depopulation. 95% or more, or greater of the population had already been wiped out by the turn of the century from the 18 to the 1900s. There was rapid and drastic changes to our traditional social, political, and economic systems during this time as well. There was the banning of traditional practices such as hula, or traditional dance. our traditional healing practices. There was an influx of foreigners to these islands, both Western, European, American, as well as Asian foreigners coming in for plantation work. And we slowly became minorities in our own homeland. And there was a tremendous exploitation of our natural and human resources here in the islands during the 1800s. Eventually, this led to a US-supported coup d'etat to depose the sovereign, Queen Liliuokalani, in 1893 and topple the Hawaiian kingdom, the Kingdom of Hawaii. Eventually, we were annexed in 1898 and received statehood in 1959. All of these, from 1893 to 1959, all was done under protest by Native Hawaiians. If you don't know, Hawaii is considered occupied territory under international law. The US never legally acquired the sovereignty of Hawaii. Thus, we're considered occupied territory. And then, of course, under the US rule, there was further suppression of Native language and customs through legislative acts. In fact, Native Hawaiian language is banned in government affairs and in the education system. And we were marginalized, discriminated against in education, employment, and housing that continues today. Ozzie Bushnell, a physician, wrote with the ironic title, The Gifts of Civilization, wrote extensively about the problem, the devastation the infectious diseases caused to our populations here in Hawaii. But he also wrote about the psychological trauma that was afflicted because of this, as well as what he referred to as those strange artifacts and alien values that disrupted the indigenous society, and that those new psychological stresses, as well as the new kinds of microbes, most certainly played important parts in the long dying of the Hawaiian race. I'm so happy he was wrong about the long dying of the Hawaiian race, and I'll come back to our current demographics today. But this olelo no ea, or proverb on the bottom, na kanaho huwale aku no ika uhane, translate as the people dismissed freely their souls and died. Now, I make this point because of the tremendous historical trauma that we talk about, the intergenerational, transgenerational trauma that our communities experience because of these historical events that affected our ancestors and are much a part of our history and who we are today, unfortunately, for better or for worse. These are factors and issues that we're still dealing with as a people, as a community. And you can see why. Tremendous impacts, negative impacts have befallen our communities since Westerners and others have come to our islands, and since the overthrow of our kingdom, and Hawaiians becoming essentially second-rate citizens under the US system. Now, just to be clear on who we're talking about, Native Hawaiians, also referred to as Kanaka Oiwi or Kanaka Maoli, are descendants of the original inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands. They are anyone with ancestry dating back to 1778, are considered Native Hawaiian. And as I mentioned before about the population decline, and here is a graph that shows that population decline that I talked about. The estimate here they have from Swanson is around 700,000 to barely 30,000 by the 1900s. And the good news is we are a population on the rise again, and we're expected to approach that for which we was the population size we were in 1778 by 2060. And we're already seeing that currently in the 2020 census. 1.6 million people in the US identify as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. Roughly 46% of those are Native Hawaiians, so vast majority, or the majority are Native Hawaiians. This represents a 31% increase from the 2010 census. So again, overall, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are a fast-growing population here in the United States. But there are major issues in our communities that we need to resolve and address, and mainly around our determinants of health. And I've listed some of them here for you. The figure there on the left shows in a socio-ecological frameworks, many of the issues, concerns, and foci that we're doing to address some of the inequities we see in our Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And this actually comes from research over the last 2 decades that we've been doing across the islands, and identifying these different areas of concerns or issues that seem to be related to the inequities we're seeing among Native Hawaiians, as well as other Pacific Islanders. But I want to highlight a few. And I want to just underscore that US occupation is a determinant of health, a negative determinant of health for Native Hawaiians. The historical trauma that has resulted from that occupation is real, and it's affecting our communities. Discrimination is continues to be an issue in our communities. And of course, in the last few years under the COVID pandemic, issues around discrimination has really surfaced again across the United States, and I would say here in Hawaii as well. And our communities, our Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, are more likely to live in obesogenic environments, toxic environments, and live in overcrowded situations, unsafe communities. Communities that lack the resources needed for healthy living. Also, we know from research that food insecurity is a big issue in our communities, bigger than any other ethnic group here in Hawaii. I don't have to talk much about the livable wage issues. I think we all know a lot about that, living here in Hawaii with the highest cost of living, or one of the highest cost of livings in the US. Inadequate educational opportunities, despite the existence of Kamehameha schools, which many people in our communities turn to as evidence of good education and access to good education for Native Hawaiians. Majority of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are still educated in our public school systems that are under-resourced, and quite frankly, in my opinion, are contributing to some of these inequities we see because of the poor resources that they're getting to educate our children. Low healthcare access and utilization is another issue we're seeing in our communities. And of course, high levels of childhood diversity. Studies have found that Native Hawaiians report more frequent and more intense childhood adverse events than any other ethnic group here in Hawaii. There's actually been national studies of NHPIs across the US and finding the same findings, in which Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders experience more childhood adversity. And as many of you know, these childhood adversities also lead to adult psychopathology as well as chronic disease risk. And just to kind of further lay the foundation of what we're dealing with, we have significant health disparities in our communities. And here I've put together both Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders because we're often aggregated together in many of these studies. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about it in that context. But basically, leading causes of death, they're not in the particular order of the greatest to the least. Cancer, heart disease, intentional injury, stroke, diabetes. If you don't know, we get chronic disease onset 10 years younger on average than other ethnic groups, especially here in Hawaii, when we compare Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders to Japanese and Caucasians. And as a result, we die about a decade earlier than other ethnic groups here in Hawaii. 22% of Native Hawaiians have greater than 3 or greater chronic conditions, comorbid conditions. 75% of Native Hawaiians, as I talked about earlier, report some adverse childhood experiences. 30% are underinsured or uninsured, and 15% live in extreme poverty. And 57% of our houseless community here in Hawaii are Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. This is a social and cultural determinant of health that I want to share with you. Mohala I ka wai ka maka o ka pua, the olelo no eau, the proverb below, is actually an ancient proverb. It literally translates as the flowers blossom because of the water. But it actually refers to a person, and it likens them to a flower in which a person can only thrive in good living conditions, where living conditions are good. This is an ancient concept, predates social and cultural determinants of health that we talk about today. So our ancestors knew very well that the health of the environment, the resources that were available to people determine their health and well-being, their longevity, their life expectancy. What I want to just quickly present here to you from left to right is the different domains, different areas for the social and cultural determinants of health. I've touched around the historical determinants. They're non-modifiable, so we can't go back in time and change them, unfortunately. However, they have led to the current situation we find ourselves in with the social, political, socioeconomic determinants. I won't spend too much time in many of this, because many of you know the determinants of health for Native Hawaiians doing work here in Hawaii. There's environmental and community determinants. But what I want to emphasize here is the cultural determinants, which I'll talk more about. I'm going to now focus more on the research we've been doing, looking at the role of racism and discrimination and its impact on Native Hawaiian health. But I would also like to highlight the far right pillar there, the biological and psychological determinants, because much of our research, much of our focus at an intervention level falls in this domain, but much, as you can see, of what is impacting the health of Native Hawaiians is really upstream. And if until we can get a better handle of the social political determinants, the environmental and community related determinants, as well as the cultural determinants. I'm just afraid there always will be health disparities for us to address because it will just be a Band-Aid. We won't really be preventing disease. We'll be just managing it, hopefully better, but certainly preventing it requires different strategies. And it requires us to understand more about what is affecting the health of Native Hawaiians beyond our traditional biomedical understanding of health and well-being. And many years ago, I really got interested in looking at the effects of racism after working with some colleagues, looking at racism and heart disease in African-American communities. And it's actually came off of some of the earlier studies I was doing where I was looking at acculturation factors or ethnic identity and the role ethnic identity was playing in the risk for disease, in particular, in this case, diabetes and depression. And what we were finding early on was really interesting. Was counter to our hypotheses, because initially we thought having a strong Hawaiian identity, a very strong connection to our communities, strong Hawaiian values and perspectives would actually be a buffer, a protector against some of these risks for chronic diseases such as heart disease and diabetes. But very early on, we're finding quite the opposite. We're finding that those Native Hawaiians who had a stronger Hawaiian identity actually were more likely to report more depression. We're more likely to have diabetes, for example. We control for all the other factors, social demographics, even degree of Hawaiian ancestry. We control for other clinical factors, and we're still finding that there was a strong relationship between the cultural identity and the risk for depression, even suicide among youth. Through our colleagues here at psychiatry, we're finding similar things, and diabetes. And as you know from other research, depression is a risk factor for diabetes, independent of other known risk factors such as physical inactivity. So there's something was going on, and we knew it wasn't a causal relationship between identity and these health outcomes we're seeing, and that it was really just a correlational thing. But what was the other factor? What was the factor that was really driving the risk for diabetes, for example, for depression? And we got to thinking about this, and really we learned a lot from the African-American community, research going on in the African-American community around discrimination. And we quickly turned to looking at racism to better explain our initial findings. And so, first of all, I want to say when we started to look at racism over a decade ago, many people were saying when we were first starting that, racism is different here in Hawaii. It's not like on the continent. We don't, and some people are even saying we don't really have racism. But, being from the Native Hawaiian community, of course, we disagree with that. And when we started to look at it empirically, what we're finding was Hawaiians were reporting a lot of discrimination and oppression. When we look at over the past 12 months, 48% of Native Hawaiians report feeling racially oppressed, often to most of the time. 52% reported feeling oppressed some of the time. And in all of our research over the years, whether on different islands with different samples of Native Hawaiians, we find almost the same thing. None of them report no racism, not experiencing any racism. It's highly prevalent in our communities here in Hawaii among our Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So we started to look at the effects of racism, interpersonal racism to be clear, and its association with physiological stress, for example, with the risk for hypertension, depression, and so forth. And we're getting some interesting findings. So early on, we looked at cortisol, a stress hormone, to look at the effects of perceived racism on diurnal cortisol levels of Native Hawaiians. And what we were finding here is really interesting. We found a negative association between diurnal cortisol levels and the experience of racism, which all of you might know would be counterintuitive at first, because as you know, usually in response to a stressor, cortisol levels or activity would go up rather than down or be flattened to get the body prepared for the fight or flight response. But when you look at chronic stressors, however, people who experience stress over a long period of time, especially that for which people are unable to manage or deal with effectively, we actually see something different. We see a flattening or blunting of the cortisol activity. And usually people don't respond to new stressors in the normal way that you would expect, which is an increase in cortisol. And we were seeing that in Native Hawaiians. In Native Hawaiians who reported more levels of experiences of racism actually had a lower diurnal cortisol activity, a flattened pattern in association with the perceived racism. We also adjusted or controlled for numerous factors, social demographics, general psychological stress, because perhaps those who just perceive more stress, just will perceive more racism. Just the world's just a terrible place. But even after adjusting for other factors, it still had a pretty robust association with the cortisol levels. We also find elevated systolic blood pressure you would expect that was positively associated with the experience of racism. We also look at hypertension risk. Granted, this was self-report, but in this initial project, in which it was actually for two of our medical students that was conducting it, they were able to link the perceptions of racism, interpersonal racism, with hypertension risk. So those individuals who reported having hypertension were more likely to report greater experiences of racism after adjusting for social demographic variables. Other colleagues have found an association with obesity. We found in several studies that associated with depression and psychological distress. One of the studies we've been doing, actually, Dr. Andrea Homosura, as part of her dissertation, she is now an assistant professor in our department. She looked at cardiovascular reactivity and recovery in Native Hawaiians, among Native Hawaiians, in response to racial stressors. So she actually designed a study in which she had developed a series of racial stressors, one being considered neutral, and another being considered blatant, another considered subtle racism. And she used social psychology techniques and strategies to develop and create these stimuli to be tested experimentally with Native Hawaiians. And through her testing, indeed, she was able to come up with a very distinct neutral interaction or stimuli, as well as a subtle and blatant stimuli. And using Native Hawaiian students, she hooked them up to measure their blood pressure, heart rate over the course of the experiment. She also mixed up the presentation, as you would expect, to make sure there was no reaction to the order of the presentation of these different stressors or levels of stressors. And what we found was really interesting. And what she did was identify pre-experiment, the level of baseline experience of racism, and categorize them as either those who experience and report a lot of experience of racism or very little, very low. And we were able to look at whether there were differences between Native Hawaiians who were, I guess, primed for discrimination versus those who were not. And what was interesting was there wasn't much differences between the two, but what was particularly important was that the role of the subtle racism. So if you don't know, cardiovascular reactivity, how quickly our body responds to a stressor, our heart rate increases, our blood pressure goes up, and everything to react to a stressor, and it's exaggerated, right? So that the recovery part is how fast it takes us, or how long it takes us to recover and go back to baseline, or the state that we were prior to that stressor, long after the stressor is removed from the environment. And what we found was a delayed, incomplete recovery with Native Hawaiians, but more so with the blatant, with the subtle stimuli, racist stimuli, not the blatant. And one would think that with the blatant, you would see more of a delayed or incomplete recovery back to baseline. But it was actually the subtle, and this is consistent with research coming out across the US, especially with African Americans, where subtle racism might be more damaging than blatant racism. You can imagine why that may be so. If it's blatant, at least you can call it for what it is. You may have some ways to deal with it. If I go to a restaurant, I feel discriminated against, I can go on Yelp, I can go on Facebook, I can tell the world about it. And I feel like at least I'm doing something. I can never go back there again, for example, and choose not to patronize that restaurant. However, when it's subtle racism, you spend a lot of cognitive energy, a lot of time trying to figure it out. And in fact, that's what our participants did. Because after the experiment, we actually asked them to describe that experience and what was going on after they viewed these stimuli. And sure enough, they were trying to make sense of the subtle. They said it was very vague, couldn't make it out, but it was frustrating. And so those are some of the works we've been doing. And recently, we've developed implicit bias test or a implicit attitude test, IAT, specific to our communities for Native, to be able to compare Native Hawaiians, what we're calling Micronesian. I realize Micronesia is not an ethnicity, however, it has become a racialized term that is used much. So we have developed IATs specifically for our populations here. And Dr. Becky Delafield, also one of our faculty, have been looking at that in relationship to, among physicians. And she has been finding that among physicians, that there is a preference toward Asian and white patients when compared to Hawaiian and Micronesian patients. Now, we have yet to understand, what does this mean? Does this lead to differential treatment with patients? Does it lead to certain patient outcomes? That work is still, something to be done. However, we are finding that there seems to be a preference towards certain groups over others. And when we look at the work Paradies and colleagues have done, and Paradies out of Australia, he's done a lot of meta-analyses, systematic reviews, puts together the research from all over the world and makes sense of it regarding racial discrimination and these mental and physical health outcomes. And as I'm showing you here, this is the multiple pathways by which he hypothesized racism affects the health of individuals based on the research that's out there. Of course, there's 3 pathways. The bottom, the assault, I think I don't need to explain that too much. Violence against people of color, communities of color, that leads to a risk for safety issues or risk for negative health outcomes. The one in the middle there, racial discrimination, leading to psychological stress, further leading to further psychological symptoms, negative coping behaviors, physiological stress and response, is basically the work we've been doing here with Native Hawaiians, the ones I just presented to you. The physiological stress response, as that I shared with you with our cortisol study. We also looked at negative coping behaviors and its effects in relationship as a mediator between perceptions of racism and psychological distress. And in fact, we looked at 14 coping behaviors, 7 for which was considered positive, the other 7 being negative. And there were 2 that really stood out as mediators, strong mediators between the relationship between perceived racism and psychological distress among Native Hawaiians after considering the social demographic factors. And they were venting, which is basically anger. And the other one was behavioral disengagement, which can be likened to learned helplessness. And it was actually these 2 that actually, there was actually no direct association or no direct path between racism and psychological distress. In fact, it was all through an indirect pathway through these 2 coping strategies. So the work we've been doing here in Hawaii with Native Hawaiians in regards to that center pathway that Paradies and colleagues are hypothesizing is what we're finding with Native Hawaiians and what we think is happening as a pathway to the higher risk for cardiovascular disease, for example, and depression among Native Hawaiians. And the top pathway there is other pathway which we commonly know of, which is denial of goods, resources or services, or poor access to good quality care, poor living conditions, and so forth, that increases the risk for these disorders. So I want to again turn to some good news because again, every so often I want to highlight some really good news from our communities, despite all of the high risk for chronic diseases and all these other issues going on. Our Hawaiian community, especially since the 1970s, where it had really taken a life of its own and really has been increased in intensity, is revitalization of traditional values and practices, such as our language. All of you, I think, are very familiar with our voyaging tradition with the hokulea and what they have been able to do and demonstrate in recent times. When we talk to when we ask Native Hawaiians, 93% of them strongly identify with their Native Hawaiian heritage and culture. And there's no statistical association between the strength of their Hawaiian identity and their degree of Hawaiian ancestry. 80% strongly believe it's important to maintain their unique cultural values and practices for psychological well-being. And despite a lot of the family adversity, we do have good news that families that report high levels of family support, emotional support, the adolescents are doing really well in these households. And cultural-based educational strategies are leading to better academic performance, cognitive and emotional engagement, and education and community engagement, and a better, just a greater sense of cultural pride and sense of place. So Native Hawaiians are returning to their cultural traditions to improve their health and well-being. And I'm sorry, I failed to mention Dr. Pacquiao, who introduced me earlier, and his colleagues also found among Native Hawaiians that historical loss and discrimination contributed to greater substance use among Native Hawaiian college students that they looked at. So I just wanted to share with you more. There are the studies that are coming out of the Cancer Center as well. So Native Hawaiians are asking for more culturally grounded approaches, not culturally tailored, but culturally grounded approaches to addressing their health and well-being. They want interventions that are more in line with their cultural values, their sense of spirituality, and delivered within a familiar community setting. So one of the things we thought about over a decade ago, looked at, was whether or not hula, let me go back here. Hula, whether or not we could leverage our cultural dance of hula for health promotion to address, in this case, heart disease, the risk for heart disease among Native Hawaiians. Now, so about, I would say 12 years ago, we started to have discussions with hula or hula experts in our communities, cultural experts, cardiologists in our community about whether or not we could scientifically look at the effects of a hula-based intervention on improving, in this case, blood pressure control among Native Hawaiians with uncontrolled blood pressure. Now, why hula, and why use it as why start with hula as a cultural grounded approach? Well, one, it's the hallmark of Hawaiian culture, and it appeals to so many people. So when you think about our ability to sustain and scale it up and out, hula makes a lot of sense. And actually, if you don't know, there's more hula schools outside of Hawaii than in Hawaii, such as Japan, Mexico, and Europe. Hula is comprised, as you all know, of specific controlled rhythmic movements that illustrate the meaning or poetry of our dances and songs, but we can control the intensity and duration through the choreography of these dances, thereby modifying the hula for people of different physical capacities. So we began this journey, again, over 12 years ago, really using a community-based participatory research approach. And we started from the beginning. We engaged the kumu hula, the hula masters, the keepers of the tradition, to really determine if, one, this was appropriate to do. Again, we were taking a Hawaiian cultural practice, very esteemed cultural practice, and we were now going to apply it to a scientific test, to potentially a controlled trial. And we wanted to make sure we did this right, and we had the support of our communities. And we also were concerned that, as a culturally grounded approach, that we didn't sacrifice or change the hula so much that it really became something that wasn't recognizable in our communities, and that it favored too much a more Western approach to health promotion. We wanted to make sure it was similar to what you would expect to get in a real hula school, delivered by a kumu hula. And then we engaged our hula masters, and what we found was they were very supportive. In fact, they reminded us of the traditions, the history of hula, and that hula has a history of healing and restoring health. And then we talked to other researchers. We got scientific experts in the area to look at what cardiologists to the table, psychologists and others, to begin talking about whether we could leverage hula and design an intervention that would be effective. And we also talked to Native Hawaiians and their families, patients that were dealing with cardiovascular disease, hypertension, to get their thoughts, whether or not this was something they would see as appropriate to manage their health. Would this be something they want to engage in? And what would they see, what are the connections for them to their lifestyle, to their cultural preferences? And very much in line with what the kumu hula were saying, they were saying that, hula, unlike more traditional Western approaches, accounts for our spirituality. It's part of our culture. There's also a social side to it because it's delivered in a group setting and emphasizes ohana, or family orientation, during the time that they're with each other in these classes, as well as the physical activity that they're getting from the dancing itself. And so we're, with all that as a foundational work, we're able to develop and test, do some feasibility studies using hula, with the idea of addressing hypertension management. in Native Hawaiians. And we did a number of things first. We needed to establish that hula could actually get the kind of physical activity level that is recommended nationally for health promotion. And so what we did was we looked at the METs, the metabolic equivalence test for hula, and compared it to existing sports, for example, or other activities. And as you can see, hula on average got 6.6 METs. So at rest, it's one. As of course, as the higher you get, the more intense the exercise, the activity becomes. And it was equivalent to a tennis game. At the lower intensity level, it was equivalent to a pickup basketball game. And at the higher intensity level, it was much more like a regular basketball or volleyball game, given the amount of time you're doing that activity and the amount of exertion that's going on. So we were really, really confident and happy about this because this was the first time hula was actually tested this way. And we were confident that we could use hula as the basis, a physical activity basis for a health promotion or a hypertension intervention. And so what we did was we worked with Kumuhula Makwana de Silva as our Kumuhula expert. The good news is she also had a degree in physical education, which really made it even better because she was able to really understand what we were trying to do with hula and develop the hula lessons that were appropriate. And what we came up with was really 12 weeks of hula lessons, 1 hour per group, delivered 2 times per week by trained Kumuhula who are trained in the protocols we developed. On the right there is the table you can see. Each hula lesson included a warm-up, a conditioning phase, and a cool-down phase. We took measures of their heart rate and so forth during the entire time to make sure they were getting the level of physical activity they needed, and appropriately so. We extended the conditioning part over time from 20 to 40 minutes. A majority of the time was spent in the continuous dancing phase. With that, we also was able to culturally tailor some heart health education, such as the importance of sodium reduction and other stress management, talking more effectively with your physician and medication management and so forth. 4 hours worth of culturally tailored materials or education curriculum. And this was all designed again by our Kumuhula and tested. We did went through numerous protocols and testing with actual halal or hula students to make sure we were thinking about this correctly. And the class components, as you can see, were, as I mentioned earlier, we were actually very, very cautious about playing it safe with the participants. And I'm actually missing some slides that I meant to put in here. So I'm gonna jump. So what I'm gonna do is jump to a 5-year study. So with the protocols in place, we actually tested that 3 months version, 3 months of our hula intervention. So to deliver twice a week for 1 hour each time over 12 weeks. And in a very small randomized control trial, it was about 57 people randomized to either a waitlist control or to immediately receive the 3-month intervention of hula. What we found was a significant reduction in systolic blood pressure. And these were Native Hawaiian adults who had uncontrolled hypertension. So their systolic blood pressure was 140 or greater at the baseline. And we had, in our pilot test, we found that that the intervention was superior to the waitlist control, in which a significant number of those individuals were able to lower their systolic blood pressure. But what we also found was really interesting during that pilot project, before I get into this 5-year study, my apologies for forgetting the additional slides here. But what I do want to share with you, which I'm going to come back to in the discussion, is that what we also found was that the improvements in social engagement predicted the improvements in blood pressure. But another thing that was associated with the improvements of blood pressure was the perceptions of discrimination. So as a result of undergoing the 3-month intervention during our pilot test, those who received the intervention, and they were both Native Hawaiian and Chuukese, so not all of the 57 participants that were randomized, about half and half, not all of them were Native Hawaiian. Half were Chuukese, the other half were Native Hawaiian. We saw no ethnic differences in the outcomes or the acceptability of the intervention. But what we did see was in both groups, Chuukese and Native Hawaiians, as a result of undergoing the hula intervention, their perceptions of racism around them decreased significantly from baseline to 3 months. The thing that was unfortunate during our pilot is that we also measured them at 6 months, 3 months after the end of the intervention, and they started to return to baseline in their blood pressures, which made us think that one, hula could be very, very effective for helping people better manage their hypertension, thereby reducing their risk for heart disease. But second, it could do so in ways beyond just the clinical and usual physical effects. And there could be the social, cultural, positive effects to doing a cultural-based intervention, such as using hula in the way I described. So we were able to get a 5-year study through the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute to do a more definitive controlled trial. And these are the 2 of the 3 specific aims. I won't cover the 3rd specific aim, which was more of a mechanistic aim. So we wanted to compare the efficacy of a 6-month intervention using hula to a waitlist control in reducing systolic blood pressure among Native Hawaiians with physician-diagnosed hypertension, but also look at cardiovascular risk scores, their risk for developing cardiovascular disease 10 years down the road as a result of undergoing the intervention. Now, this is the overall study design. We were able to assess 446 Native Hawaiians across 3 islands, Oahu, Maui, and Hawaii Island, again, with our community partners that included community health centers, as well as Native Hawaiian healthcare systems, and some grassroots organizations or communities such as Hawaiian homesteads. And we were able to assess 446. Of that, 263 were eligible and willing to participate, and they all received, and I want to emphasize this because I'll come back to this point later in understanding our results. They all receive a basic heart health education. Those 4 lessons the 4 hours worth of lessons I spoke about earlier were delivered to everyone prior to them going into their assigned groups. After that was completed, they were based on randomization within each community site. They were either randomized into Olohoi Hula, which means to restore life through hula, which was the name of our hula-based program, or into education waitlist only control. And as you can see here, it was balanced between the 2 arms. They were assessed at 3 months, 6 months, and for the intervention group, again at 12 months. At the end of 6 months, the intervention was offered to the waitlist control group. Our communities insisted on this design. They did not want to withhold any further what could be an effective intervention from their communities. So this was the arrangement that was acceptable to our community partners. As you can see, we had really great retention, retention that is very, very good, considering that most clinical trials of this length and of this duration usually gets more, unfortunately, there's more people dropping out of the study, especially communities that are often considered high risk. All of them are Native Hawaiians in this particular study, although the pilot, as I mentioned, also included Chukis. For this particular study, it was all Native Hawaiians with physician-diagnosed hypertension. They had no heart disease or stroke, no cardiovascular disease. Again, we were trying to see whether or not we could decrease their 10-year risk. And all of them needed to be under physician care for at least 6 months and greater than 18 years old, and all needed to have a systolic blood pressure above 140, which at the time of the start of the study was considered uncontrolled hypertension. Here are the sites I mentioned earlier where our partnerships across the different islands. These are actual pictures of some of our hula classes in different communities. We have permission to share their images with you. So again, I touched on this early, the first 3 months of this 6-month intervention. It was exactly what we tested in the first, in our pilot. We didn't change anything. It was very effective. What we did change or add to was these additional 3 months, which is really about maintaining the positive changes that our participants were getting from the first 3 months of hula and ensuring that they could make this behavior change that they needed to make, sustain that over time. And using self-regulation theory, we designed an additional 3 months of intervention called makahana ka'ike. Makahana ka'ike in Hawaiian means by doing one learns, by putting into practice, that is where knowledge is really acquired. So really working with them on goal setting, going through matching some of their values and time management to their goals and objectives, continuing with the hula training. We also had some peer discussions that were led by community facilitators. We also did some educational review of the curriculum, the healthy curriculum I talked about earlier, and so forth. But really was the idea here was really to get them to make the hula, other physical activity, and some of these other behavior changes we're asking them to do, such as lessening their salt intake and so forth, a part of their daily lives, and helping them to do that over these latter 3 months. So here are the number of participants. We had 263 Native Hawaiians in total, as I mentioned. 84% were female. I'll come back to that later in discussion. Average age was 58 years. 45%, nearly half, had diabetes. 86% were on medication for the high blood pressure, which is interesting because they all needed to be under physician care. And they all were uncontrolled, but not all of them were on medication, but 86% were. The average number of medications, I believe, was 1.8. 73% had dance hula before. This is not professionally or in a long-term way. As you know, in Hawaii, all of us dance hula at some point, whether that's for May Day in school, in elementary school, or high school. Average starting blood pressure was balanced between the two arms. And all other characteristics were well balanced across arms, except for weight. Weight was slightly higher in the weightless control group. So we did control for weight going forward. And these are our results in regards to AIM-1. Can hula help have an effect on systolic blood pressure? And we found, yes, it can. On the left there, in the red shaded boxes, is our Olohoi Kahula, the hula intervention. On the right is the blue boxes, or blue bars, rather, is the education only control. And as you can see, from baseline to 3 months, they all started in stage 2 at baseline. We were using the pre-2017 change to the clinical guidelines. So that's what I'm presenting here. So stage 2, they all were 140 and above. They all, everyone in the Oloho on average, not everyone, was able to drop 2 levels down to was categorized as elevated. And we saw a slight reduction at 6 months, a further reduction at 6 months. The education only never reached that far down, never went under 130 on average, and kind of maintained at 6 months there. And that difference was statistically significant. More importantly, when we look at it, perhaps this is where the clinical significance might come in, is the number of individuals that were able to drop 130 over 80, below 130 over 80. And as you can see, it was 2 times higher in our intervention group. 43% of those that received the hula intervention were able to get their blood pressure down so low that it was considered controlled, fully controlled, whereas only 21% of the control was able to do that. Remind you, this is not a true control. They did receive the heart health culturally tailored that was previously tested with Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and found effective, was given this at prior to being randomized, if you recall. So they basically all receive heart health education and some attention as well. So this is truly not a control group. And remember, all of them are under physician care, being treated for hypertension. So, I like to think the hula has an incremental effect, a significant incremental effect above basic heart health education that's needed for all patients with hypertension, as well as what is being treated by our physicians here. And when we looked at AIM-2, 10-year cardiovascular disease rate, we went back and forth on the appropriate risk calculator to use. We ended up with using the Framingham risk score calculator, based on consultation with some national experts and around hypertension experts and so forth. A lot of conversation. Eventually, we settled on using the Framingham, and using the Framingham calculator. So we did collect some. We did some tests to get their lipids, their HDLs, their LDLs, and other things that we needed to enter into the risk calculator. And when we did that, we found that those who received the hula, again, about 2 times greater reduction in their 10-year risk for cardiovascular disease compared to the control group. Now, again, I caution you on how we can interpret this, because, again, a lot of these risk calculators have not been adequately validated. In fact, not validated at all with Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders. There's been some work with American Indians, but yet, still not much work to better understand what these scores mean. It would be safe to say, whatever the absolute value means, there was a reduction that was greater than that in the control group. And then we looked 1 year later, 12 months after starting our study, after entering the intervention, 6 months after stopping the intervention, at least the formal part of our intervention, whether or not By the way, we also saw significant improvements in diastolic blood pressure, which I did not present. I was focusing here on the systolic, but we also found significant reductions similar to the systolic for the diastolic blood pressure. And when we look at all of this, as well as their risk scores at 12-month follow-up, we found that there was no significant change in the improvements, that they maintained essentially the improvements we saw at 6 months, which is quite different from our pilot project. If you recall, I mentioned within a matter of 3 months, they started to return to baseline as far as their blood pressure. We did not see that. That was a good news for us. We saw that it was maintained 6 months post the cessation, the stopping of our intervention, cessation of the intervention rather. So summary, colonization and racism are key determinants of health for Native Hawaiians. Racism is associated with both physical and mental health conditions to include hypertension, obesity, and depression. Revitalization of traditional perspectives and practices offer a pathway to health equity for Native Hawaiians, as we demonstrated through our HULA study. And leveraging Native Hawaiian cultural practices for health promotion can result in both clinically and culturally meaningful outcomes. So what I did not present to you was the aim 3 that I talk about that was mechanistic. We're actually looking at a structural equation model, looking at what might be the mediators of our intervention effect on blood pressure and cardiovascular disease risk. And actually, Dr. Tom Wills is helping us, as well as Dr. Palov, to complete that. And we're finding, again, that maybe we are seeing a similar effect with the role of discrimination, that discrimination somehow also might be a modest mediator in the effects, meaning that our intervention somehow is affecting their perceptions of racism around them, as well as that is affecting their blood pressure in a positive way. So we're hoping to have more, as we look further into the data, to understand better, how do we get these results? I don't think it's the physical activity alone. I think there's some other things happening that's leading people to make positive changes in their lives that is leading to the blood pressure improvements. We do know that those who participated in the HULA intervention also had better compliance or adherence to their medical regimen, or their medication compliance or adherence rather. So we do know that it had an effect on them in that way as well. So more to come, hopefully. But again, thank you for your time. And this concludes my talk for today. And I welcome any questions. And I just want to mahalo nui thank our funders. So much of the work that, especially the HULA project that I presented, was supported by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. The other work on racism in particular, mainly through the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. I would like to also just quickly mention we're currently adapting our HULA intervention to address the vascular risk factors for Alzheimer's and other related dementia with funding from the National Institutes of Aging. We'll be starting a clinical trial looking at the effects of our HULA intervention modified for older population of Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders as well, to see whether or not we can improve the vascular risk factors, being diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and so forth, dyslipidemia, but also the effects on cognitive functioning. So we will be measuring their cognitive functioning throughout the study to see whether or not the intervention can have an effect as well in that arena. But I'll conclude here. Thank you very much. Mahalo. Are people still there? Questions or?
You found that you had a 84% in one of your study were women. Do you think that what you're studying has a differential gender effect? Were you able to evaluate that?
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, for that question. I meant to come back to that. I forgot. Thank you. Yes, well, let's be clear, because everyone's saying, oh, it's probably because it's HULA, you had more women. That may be true. But quite honestly, with all of our trials that we've had, whether it's for lifestyle intervention to address obesity or diabetes, we usually have roughly about 80% women participate. It's just unfortunate we can't get more men. But we did look at whether or not gender had an effect on the outcomes. based on, it's a sample size issue, of course, but we did not find that it differed. It benefited both men and women in the same way. And we are trying to make a stronger effort to get more men into our study for the current project that we're doing. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question.
Any more questions for Dr. Kahalakula?
Are there any plans for pushing out these interventions? Let's say in the DOE system and the school system. It seems like just the education alone had a huge impact on the high blood pressure rates. So I mean, it seems like it would be a great idea to establish something similar to the DARE program, where you come in for a day, try to apply these interventions to students at younger ages. But are there any plans in the works for doing such a thing, out of curiosity?
Well, as far as getting our hula intervention out into the community, we have talked about getting into our school systems. Actually, our Kumu Hula Mapuana de Silva has a number of our students who actually work in some of our school systems and have an interest in bringing this into the schools. The good news is our intervention is now being used by several clinics here in Hawaii, to include Queens Health Systems on Hawaii Island at their North Hawaii site, as well as some of their ambulatory clinics here on Oahu. And they're collecting data, and they're finding that now when applied into, when delivered in a real world setting, outside of a clinical trial with all the controls, they're still finding improved blood pressure in people who are uncontrolled in the program. So we're happy that it's continuing and people are utilizing, which is what you don't get usually with your standard culturally tailored interventions. I think with hula, it's so appealing that a lot of clinics and others wanted to immediately adapt it for their settings. And so we help them with that. We actually provide funding through our Ulu funds from Queens that goes out to the communities via our department to help them get started and trained in offering. The good news is we actually identify kumu hula that are specific to the communities or the areas where these interventions are being delivered, so that it's relevant to their area. As you know, with hula, it's very place-based. And so we want to make sure that's done right. So that is happening already. Aloha Care now will reimburse. They have a program to reimburse for certain Hawaiian practices, and our project actually helped to inform that, to make sure they were comfortable in reimbursing for this for hula as a health promotion strategy. I hope I answered your question, Ryan. But as far as getting it into the schools yet, we have talked about it. It just hasn't happened yet, but it is an idea that we have spoken about.
There are a couple of questions on the chat. There's a question from Dr. John Shepard. Do you think paddling or surfing might be an alternative to hula for men and women as well?
Yeah, no, it can be. Certainly, those, I think, great physical activities. It's just that, you gotta have a particular lifestyle to be able to sustain that over time. Hula we just found would be easier to adopt for most people across different lifestyles or settings. Whereas it doesn't require too much effort to go down to the beach, for example, and be a part of a club. But I do think, don't get me wrong, I do think there's positive benefits to that, especially for men. But again, it'll be age specific, right? I mean, many young people we paddle, or some, are able to do it throughout a lifetime. But once you start working a regular job, it's very difficult to make it down to the beach on a regular basis. Whereas with hula, you can actually do it in your home, right, after you learn it and so forth. Or you can find time in your schedule somewhere where you can join a halau and so forth. But I do think hula, paddling, other things that from a cultural standpoint beyond paddling that others have thought about was lua or Hawaiian martial arts, for example. To use that to attract more men and get them involved in that way. I think Sharday also has her hand up.
Yeah.
Mahalo. I was just curious if you have specific mana'o on the possible impacts of colonization versus occupation? If there's, or if you see that as kind of having the same or any differences there?
So your question, Sade, is more of a broader political question rather than, are you asking if those have a impact on the results or the experience of racism, or just my thoughts in general about that historical thing?
Well, I've seen Aboriginal or First Nations people specifically point to colonization in their research papers. So I guess I was just curious if you are specifically calling out occupation instead, or yeah, I guess just more your thoughts.
Yeah, okay, well, so you're asking more broadly on a political level. I use occupation over colonization because many of my Hawaiian study colleagues have made it a point to say that we weren't technically colonized. However, the effects are similar, right? As you would find in other colonized communities that have been colonized. I don't know if I answered your question, Sade.
Cool, mahalo.
The question also being asked here, did the 60-minute intervention include the lessons, peer discussion, or were the lessons in addition? They were in addition to the hula lessons. And at the latter 6 months, we actually wrote, every other week we had a different activity. So the first 3 months was just hula. So the lessons as far as the heart health education, where we talked about the importance of sodium reduction, managing their, what they're eating, physical activity, medication management, and so understanding the medication better and so forth, the importance of following the medical advice. That was all done up front within the first 2 weeks prior to getting randomized. So once they were randomized, the first 3 months was just hula. Then the latter 3 months of that 6-month intervention, it alternated. So 1 week it was hula, next week was a peer group, and the next week was lessons and so forth. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
There's one more question in the chat before Hallie's.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Pian. Yeah.
Testing the hula outside of Hawaii, I guess, is the question. Where it might be less important. Well, I don't know about less important, especially for certain groups out there in the community elsewhere that obviously practice hula. Like I mentioned, hula is there's more hula schools outside of Hawaii than in Hawaii. We actually, so part of our pilot studies, our feasibility studies, we actually had a diverse group of people participate. So non-Pacific Islanders, non-Native Hawaiians. It was very well received. And in fact, we saw benefits to their blood pressure and other clinical measures in a very small sample where we tested initially the hula intervention at Queens Hospital, at Queens Medical Center, actually. So I would say it does benefit more than just Hawaiians. And it could have benefits for others who value this, right? Again, this is a culturally grounded approach. I'm not saying it's going to be effective for Germans or for Irish people. It's going to be effective for Native Hawaiians and perhaps Pacific Islanders that share similar values and really to address their particular health disparities and inequities. I know in science, we're often concerned about how this generalizes to other populations, but they may actually inhibit us from actually finding solutions for very specific populations. Sometimes one size does not fit all. And we just need to recognize that and find a size that fits for our communities. I hope I answered that question.
I guess one last question is hand raised.
Sorry, thank you for answering earlier on. I had one additional question. So there are racial and ethnic disparities in bone mineral density, especially in postmenopausal women, it's an issue. And in groups, especially with patients with cancers like myeloma, with bone degeneration over time. I was just curious if anybody has looked at, or if anybody was planning to look at, the effects of the hula intervention on bone mineral density in these populations, and if it could be used as a possible intervention for encouraging osteogenesis.
Yeah, it will be interesting to look. I mean, we know exercise can help, right? Especially weight-bearing exercises and so forth. And hula, to some degree, there's a lot of up and down with the legs that might be almost like squatting. Yeah. But I no, we haven't looked at it. Would be interesting though, Ryan. Are you suggesting a collaboration?
Oh, no, not yet. I'm still a graduate student, so there's not much I can do.
Oh.
But it'd be interesting because the weight bearing exercise has always been a big one for osteogenesis. But with things like walking, possibly the simplest weight bearing you have, it's been shown to really only affect the long bones in the legs and the hips. In order to make any kind of impact on, say, the spine, you need some kind of more rigorous weight bearing, like performing weight squats or something. But it'd be interesting, since there's so much dynamic movement in hula, if it could impact the spine or any other structures that are affected by these.
Yeah, and as you know, you can use implements to dance hula that can have weight to them. I mean, I've danced hula where I've held something for about 10 minutes up in the air all around, which puts it's almost like you're doing presses for your shoulders at times. So there's be interesting, right? That's not my area, but we welcome collaborations, and if there's more ways to show benefits of dancing hula in other ways, that'll be great.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
The TD skirt's like 50 pounds. Thanks, Sharday.
Okay, it's 1:10, and I guess we'll end the seminar here. Thank you everyone for your time, and especially thank you, Dr. Kalakula, for your time and for the wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Aloha.
Bye.